My name is Marcus Webb, and I've been a commercial deep-sea rescue diver for 14 years. I've pulled bodies from sunken vessels off the coast of Alaska, repaired oil rig foundations in the North Sea during winter storms, and recovered black boxes from aircraft wreckage at depths that would crush most people's lungs before they even realized what was happening. I've seen things down there that would make your skin crawl. The way a drowned man's face looks after 3 weeks in cold water. The peculiar way metal groans when it's about to give way under pressure. The absolute and total darkness that exists below 200 meters, where even the most powerful lights seem to get swallowed whole. But nothing in my career prepared me for what happened during a routine salvage operation in the Aleutian Trench off the coast of Unalaska, Alaska, in October of 2019. The mission was supposed to be straightforward: locate and document a sunken research vessel called the Perseus IV that had gone down during a storm 6 months prior, assess the wreckage, and determine if any sensitive equipment or data could be recovered. The vessel had been conducting some kind of geological survey when it sent out a distress call and then went silent. The Coast Guard had searched for survivors, but found nothing except an oil slick and some floating debris. The insurance company wanted eyes on the wreck before they paid out the claim, and our company, Abyssal Recovery Solutions, got the contract. I was working out of Dutch Harbor at the time, and when the call came through, I was honestly relieved to have something to do. October in the Aleutians is brutal: constant rain, wind that cuts through every layer you're wearing, and a darkness that seems to settle into your bones. The locals call it the beginning of the long dark, and after spending 2 weeks waiting for weather windows that never came, I was ready to get wet and earn my pay. My dive partner was a guy named Chen Rodriguez, a former Navy saturation diver who'd been in the commercial sector for about 8 years. Chen was solid, methodical, careful. The kind of guy who checked his equipment 3 times before every dive and never took unnecessary risks. We'd worked together on maybe a dozen jobs, and I trusted him with my life, which in this business is about as high a compliment as you can give someone. The operation was being run from a vessel called the Nordic Surveyor, a 180-foot support ship with dynamic positioning and a saturation diving system that would let us stay down longer if we needed to make multiple dives. The captain was a weathered Norwegian named Bjorn Halvorsen, who'd been running salvage operations in the North Pacific for 30 years and had the kind of face that looked like it had been carved from driftwood. He didn't say much, but when he did speak, people listened. The crew was small, maybe 10 people, total, including the dive team, the ROV operators, the medical, tech, and the ship's crew. Everyone knew their job, and there was no room for amateurs this far out. We left Dutch Harbor on October 19th, just after dawn, though dawn at that latitude and time of year is more of a suggestion than an actual event. The sky went from black to gray, and that was about as good as it got. The seas were running at about 8 feet with a long swell, which was considered calm for that part of the world. The Perseus IV had gone down approximately 43 nautical miles northwest of Unalaska, in an area where the continental shelf drops off dramatically into the Aleutian Trench. The last known position put the wreck at a depth of around 320 meters, well within the range for a saturation dive, but deep enough that everything had to be done by the numbers. The transit took us about 6 hours, and we spent most of it going over the mission parameters, checking equipment, and reviewing the limited information we had about the Perseus IV. She'd been a research vessel operated by something called the Pelagic Geophysical Institute, which I'd never heard of. But apparently, they did contract work for various government agencies and private companies studying underwater geology, seismic activity, that sort of thing. The vessel itself was relatively new, only 5 years old, and had been purpose-built for deep water operations. According to the specs, she had reinforced hull plating, redundant systems, and more safety equipment than most ships twice her size. Whatever had taken her down had done it fast. We reached the site just after 2 p.m, and Bjorn brought the Nordic surveyor into position, using the GPS coordinates from the Coast Guard report. The sea conditions had deteriorated slightly during the transit. The swell was now running closer to 10 feet, and the wind had picked up to about 20 knots from the northwest, bringing with it a cold, stinging rain that made everything on deck slippery and miserable. The crew deployed the ROV first, a work-class remotely operated vehicle with high-definition cameras and sonar mapping capability. The plan was to get a visual on the wreck, create a detailed survey of the site, and then plan our dive based on what we found. The ROV went down at 1400 hours, exactly. I watched the feed from the control room, a cramped space filled with monitors and the quiet hum of electronics. The operator was a young woman named Sarah Voss, who'd come up through the offshore oil industry and had steady hands and a good eye for detail. The water off Unalaska is murky even in the best conditions, lots of suspended sediment and plankton, and visibility on the camera dropped to almost nothing within the first 50 meters. The ROV descended using its sonar to navigate, the pinging echoing through the speakers in a rhythm that was almost hypnotic. At 100 meters, we started getting intermittent thermal layers that played havoc with the sonar imaging. At 200 meters, the water temperature had dropped to just above freezing, and the camera feed showed nothing but darkness and the occasional cluster of marine snow drifting past the lens. Sarah kept the ROV on a steady descent, adjusting for the current that was running stronger than expected at depth. At 280 meters, the sonar picked up something large on the bottom, and she slowed the descent, bringing the ROV in for a closer look. The Perseus IV appeared out of the darkness like a ghost ship, her hull lights casting pale circles of illumination that seemed to make the water around her even darker by comparison. She was resting upright on the bottom, which was unusual. Most vessels that sink in deep water end up on their side or completely inverted. Her superstructure was intact, and there was no obvious sign of catastrophic damage, like an explosion or collision. The hull plating showed some deformation on the starboard side, but nothing that should have been enough to sink her. Sarah maneuvered the ROV around the wreck, taking detailed video from every angle, while the sonar built up a 3-dimensional map of the site. That's when we noticed the first oddity. The vessel's exterior lights were still on, not just the emergency lights, but the main deck lighting, the navigation lights, even the lights in the windows of the bridge. After 6 months on the bottom, the batteries should have been long dead, but somehow power was still flowing through the system. Chen and I exchanged a glance, and I could see he was thinking the same thing I was. This didn't make sense. Bjorn frowned at the monitor and said something in Norwegian that I didn't understand, but his tone made it clear he wasn't happy about it. Sarah brought the ROV in closer, focusing the camera on the bridge windows. Through the murk, we could see the interior of the bridge, and everything appeared to be in place. Charts on the table, equipment on the consoles, even a coffee mug sitting on the navigation station. There was no sign of panic or struggle, no indication that the crew had attempted to evacuate. The life raft canisters were still in their mountings, and the survival suits were hanging in their rack by the door. Whatever had happened, it had either happened too fast for anyone to react, or the crew had chosen not to abandon ship. We spent another hour documenting the exterior of the wreck, noting the positions of hatches, the condition of the hull, and identifying the safest entry points for a manned dive. The main deck hatch was partially open, which would give us access to the interior without having to cut our way in. The plan was to enter through the main deck, work our way forward to the bridge to recover the ship's log and any electronic data storage, then sweep the interior for any sign of the crew or indication of what had caused the sinking. It was a straightforward plan, and we'd executed similar dives dozens of times before. We started our saturation dive at 0600 the next morning. The weather had improved slightly overnight. The rain had stopped, and the wind had dropped to around 15 knots, which made deck operations easier. Chen and I had spent the previous evening in the saturation chamber, breathing a helium-oxygen mixture, while the pressure was gradually increased to match the pressure at 320 meters. Saturation diving is the only way to work at that depth for extended periods. You live in a pressurized chamber on the ship, and when it's time to dive, you transfer through a pressurized tunnel to a diving bell that gets lowered to the work site. You can stay down as long as you need to, because your body tissues are already saturated with the breathing gas, and you only have to decompress once at the end of the entire operation, which can take days. The helium made our voices sound like cartoon characters, high-pitched and distorted, but you get used to it after a while. Chen and I ran through our pre-dive checks in the bell, communication systems, breathing gas supplies, heating elements in our hot water suits, cutting tools, lights, everything. The bell was cramped, barely enough room for 2 divers and the support equipment, and the walls were running with condensation from our breath. Outside the small viewport, I could see the dark water rushing past as the bell descended on its cable. At 300 meters, we felt the bell slow, and the descent became more gradual as the winch operator on the surface carefully positioned us above the wreck. Through the viewport, I could see the lights of the Perseus 4 below us, still burning impossibly bright in the darkness. The bell touched down on the deck of the wreck with a gentle thump, and the bell operator gave us clearance to exit. Chen went first, opening the bottom hatch and swimming out into the open water. I followed a moment later, my breathing loud in my helmet, and the hot water pumping through my suit, keeping the cold at bay. The first thing that struck me was how quiet it was. At that depth, you can usually hear the ambient sounds of the ocean, the distant calls of whales, the clicking of shrimp, the groan of currents moving over underwater features. But here, there was nothing except the sound of my own breathing and the faint hiss of the communication system. It was like the ocean itself was holding its breath. The lights from the ship created a circle of visibility, maybe 20 feet across, beyond which there was only absolute darkness pressing in from all sides. Chen and I made our way to the main deck hatch, moving slowly and carefully across the deck that was covered with a thin layer of silt and the kind of marine growth you'd expect after 6 months underwater. Our umbilicals, the thick hoses that connected us to the bell and provided breathing gas, hot water, and communications, trailed behind us, and I was constantly aware of their position to make sure we didn't get tangled. The hatch was indeed partially open, wedged in place by something I couldn't quite see. Chen examined it briefly, then used a pry bar to force it the rest of the way open. The hinges groaned even underwater, the sound vibrating through the water and into my chest. The interior of the ship was dark despite the exterior lights still functioning. I switched on my helmet light, and Chen did the same, our beams cutting through the murk and illuminating a narrow passageway that led forward into the vessel. The water inside was slightly clearer than outside, but there was something about it that felt wrong. It seemed thicker somehow, more resistant, like swimming through gelatin. We moved forward, checking each compartment as we passed. The crew quarters were empty, bunks neatly made, personal effects still in place. The galley showed signs of a meal in progress, plates on the table, pots on the stove, everything frozen in time like a maritime Marie Celeste. We reached the bridge after maybe 10 minutes of careful swimming through the passageways. The door was closed, and Chen tried the handle, which turned easily. He pushed the door open, and we entered what should have been the nerve center of the vessel. The bridge was larger than I'd expected, with wide windows looking out into the dark water, banks of electronic equipment, and a large chart table in the center, and everything was still functioning. Screens glowed with data, indicator lights blinked in sequence, and the ship's computer was displaying what looked like a navigation plot. Except the plot showed the ship moving, tracking a course across the screen in real time, even though we were sitting on the bottom 300 meters down. Chen's voice came through the communication system, distorted by the helium, but understandable. "Marcus, are you seeing this? The systems are active. How is that possible?" I didn't have an answer. The ship's batteries should have died weeks ago, and even if they hadn't, the ship's computer shouldn't be showing navigation data unless the GPS and motion sensors were still receiving input. But we were underwater, and there was no GPS signal at this depth, and the ship was stationary on the bottom. Unless the system was malfunctioning and replaying old data, but that didn't explain why everything else was still powered. I moved to the chart table and found the ship's log, a leather-bound book that was used as a backup to the electronic systems. I carefully placed it in a waterproof recovery bag and sealed it, then moved to the main computer console. The system was password protected, but there was an external data port that would let us download the contents without needing to log in. I connected a specialized waterproof storage device and initiated the transfer, watching as gigabytes of data began copying over. The transfer would take about 15 minutes, so Chen and I used the time to search the rest of the bridge for anything else of interest. That's when I noticed the photographs. There were several of them pinned to a corkboard near the captain's chair. Pictures of the crew, smiling and waving at the camera. The kind of casual snapshots people take to remember good times. But something about them bothered me, and it took me a moment to realize what it was. The background in the photos showed the deck of the Perseus IV, but the sky was wrong. It was dark, but not the darkness of night. It was the darkness of deep water, the same crushing darkness we were swimming through right now. The photos had been taken underwater, after the ship had sunk, but the crew in the pictures were acting like everything was normal, like they were still sailing on the surface. I reached out to take one of the photos for a closer look, and my glove passed through it. Not through the photograph itself, but through the space where it should have been. The image was there, clearly visible, but when I tried to touch it, there was nothing but water. I pulled my hand back, my heart rate spiking, and took a step away from the corkboard. Chen was on the other side of the bridge, examining the communication equipment, and I was about to call him over when the lights in the bridge suddenly intensified, becoming so bright that I had to look away. The glow was coming from everywhere at once. The overhead fixtures, the computer screens, even the water itself seemed to be luminescing with a cold, blue-white light that hurt to look at. And then I heard it. A sound that seemed to come from inside my helmet, inside my head. A low-frequency vibration that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. It wasn't mechanical, and it wasn't like anything I'd ever heard underwater before. It was almost like a voice, but not a human voice. Something that was trying to form words, but couldn't quite manage it. Syllables stretching and distorting, like audio played at the wrong speed. Chen's voice cut through the noise, panicked now. "Marcus, we need to get out of here. Something's wrong with my breathing gas. I'm seeing things." I turned to look at him, and in the too bright light, I could see that his movements were uncoordinated, his arms reaching out as if he was trying to grab onto something that wasn't there. The symptoms matched nitrogen narcosis or high-pressure nervous syndrome, but we were breathing the right gas mixture for this depth, and we'd been down long enough that any negative effects should have already manifested. I moved toward him, reaching out to steady him, when the data transfer completed with a soft beep from the storage device. I grabbed it, disconnecting it from the console, and reached for Chen's arm. "We're leaving. Now." "Follow me and stay close." He nodded, or at least I think he did. His movements were sluggish, and in the strange light, it was hard to tell what was real and what was a trick of the water and shadows. I led him back toward the door, but when I pushed it open, the passageway beyond was different. The walls were the same, the layout was the same, but the quality of the space had changed. The corridor seemed to stretch much farther than it had when we'd entered, and the walls were covered with something that looked like frost or crystallized salt, geometric patterns that caught the light and refracted it into colors that didn't quite look right. We moved forward anyway, because there was no other choice. Our umbilicals were still behind us, which meant the bell was still in that direction, even if the route seemed wrong. I kept one hand on Chen's shoulder, making sure he was following, and used the other to pull us along the walls. The passageway seemed to curve in ways that didn't match my memory of the ship's layout, turning back on itself, branching into corridors that I was certain hadn't been there before. The sound in my head was getting louder, and now I could make out something like words in the noise. Not English, not any language I recognized, but there was a pattern to it, a rhythm that suggested meaning, even if I couldn't understand it. We passed through a doorway and emerged into a space that was too large to be inside the ship. A vast, open area where the water seemed to disappear into darkness in all directions. And the only light came from below. A faint, pulsing glow that reminded me of bioluminescence, but was too regular, too deliberate to be natural. Floating in the water around us were objects I couldn't identify. Geometric shapes that rotated slowly, surfaces that reflected our lights in ways that made my eyes hurt, things that might have been equipment or might have been something else entirely. And in the center of it all was something that I can only describe as a structure, though that word doesn't really capture what I was seeing. It was made of angles and curves that didn't connect properly, that seemed to fold in on themselves and extend into dimensions that my brain couldn't quite process. Chen's breathing was rapid now, on the edge of hyperventilating, and I realized that my own heart rate was dangerously elevated. I forced myself to look away from the structure, focusing instead on the umbilicals that were still trailing behind us, still leading back to safety. I gave Chen's shoulder a squeeze and started moving, following our lifelines back the way we'd come, or at least the way I hoped we'd come. The umbilicals led us through the impossible space, past the geometric shapes and the pulsing lights, and then suddenly we were back in the corridor, narrow and cramped and exactly as it should be. The relief was overwhelming, but I didn't let myself stop. I kept moving, pulling Chen along, retracing our path through the ship. The frost patterns on the walls were gone, and the passageways were back to their normal dimensions. We reached the main deck hatch and swam through it, emerging onto the exterior deck of the Perseus IV. The bell was exactly where we'd left, it maybe 30 feet away, its lights a warm yellow in contrast to the cold blue of the ship's illumination. We covered the distance in what felt like seconds, and I helped Chen up into the bell before pulling myself in behind him. The bell operator's voice came through immediately, calm and professional. "Divers recovered, preparing for ascent. Everything okay down there?" I didn't answer right away. I was checking Chen's gauges, making sure his breathing gas supply was adequate, looking for any sign of equipment malfunction that might explain what we'd experienced. Everything looked normal. The gas mixture was correct, the flow rates were proper, and there was no indication of contamination or system failure. Chen was starting to calm down, his breathing returning to normal, and when I looked into his eyes through his helmet viewport, he seemed more coherent. The bell began its ascent, the wreck dropping away beneath us, and I watched through the viewport as the lights of the Perseus IV faded into the darkness. In those final moments before we lost sight of her completely, I thought I saw movement on the deck, figures standing near the rail, watching us leave. But when I blinked and looked again, There was nothing there except the empty deck and the lights that had no business still burning. The ascent took 40 minutes, and Chen and I spent it in silence, each of us processing what we'd seen, trying to make sense of it. When the bell was recovered onto the deck of the Nordic Surveyor, and we transferred back into the saturation chamber, the support crew could tell something was off. The medical tech, a serious man named Dr. Petrov, who'd worked in commercial diving for 20 years, ran us through a battery of tests, blood gas analysis, neurological assessments, cognitive function checks. Everything came back normal. Physically, we were fine. But both Chen and I knew that what we'd experienced wasn't a hallucination caused by gas mixture or pressure exposure. We spent the next 3 days in the chamber while the pressure was gradually reduced, going through the decompression schedule that would allow our bodies to safely off-gas the dissolved helium. During that time, I reviewed the video footage from our helmet cameras, trying to find some evidence of what we'd encountered, but the footage showed nothing unusual. We entered the ship, we searched the bridge, we recovered the data storage device, and we exited. There was no strange light, no impossible spaces, no geometric structures. The cameras had recorded a routine salvage dive, nothing more. But the ship's log and the data storage device told a different story. I reviewed them with Bjorn and the rest of the team after we'd completed decompression, and what we found raised more questions than it answered. The log entries from the Perseus the Fuz's final days were increasingly erratic, describing equipment malfunctions, navigation errors, and crew members reporting strange experiences. Sounds with no source, lights in the water, a persistent feeling of being watched. The final entry, dated the day before the ship went down, was almost illegible, the handwriting degrading into scribbles and symbols that didn't appear to be any known language. The data from the ship's computer was even more disturbing. The navigational logs showed the Perseus IV had been conducting a survey of an underwater feature the crew referred to only as Site 7, a location approximately 10 miles from where the ship eventually sank. The sonar imaging and depth soundings from Site 7 showed an anomaly on the ocean floor, a depression or trench that appeared to be much deeper than the surrounding terrain, deeper than should have been possible given the known bathymetry of the region. The ship had made multiple passes over the site, deploying various instruments and sensors, and each time they did, the electronic systems had experienced glitches and interference. The last set of data, recorded just hours before the ship's final transmission, included video footage from a remotely operated vehicle that had been sent down to investigate Site 7 directly. I watched the footage with a growing sense of dread, recognizing the same geometric patterns and impossible angles that I'd seen in the bridge of the Perseus IV. The ROV had descended into the depression, and as it went deeper, the footage became increasingly distorted, colors shifting through spectrums that shouldn't exist, the shape of the seafloor seeming to change and flow like liquid. And then, just before the feed cut out entirely, there was a moment where the camera captured something that I still don't have words for. A presence, vast and utterly alien, aware and watching. The footage ended there. Whatever the Perseus IV had found at Site 7, it had followed them. Or perhaps they had brought something back with them, some contamination or influence that had turned their ship into a threshold between one reality and another. The vessel hadn't sunk because of a storm or mechanical failure. It had been pulled down, drawn into the deep by something that existed in those crushing depths, something that predated human understanding and operated by rules that had nothing to do with physics as we know it. Bjorn decided to abort the operation after reviewing the data. He cited safety concerns and the likelihood of additional complications, but I think he was as unsettled as the rest of us. The insurance company wasn't happy about it. They'd paid a lot of money for a complete salvage assessment, and we'd only made one dive. But Bjorn was adamant. We packed up the equipment, pulled the ROV, and began the transit back to Dutch Harbor. The weather had turned again, and the trip back was rough. The Nordic Surveyor, pitching and rolling in heavy seas that matched my mood perfectly. I tried to put it out of my mind, to file it away as just another strange experience in a career full of them, but I couldn't. The memory of that space inside the ship, the geometric structure, the sense of vast intelligence observing us, it stuck with me. I started having trouble sleeping, waking up in the middle of the night with the feeling that I was still underwater, still swimming through those impossible corridors. Chen called me a few weeks after we got back, and I could tell from his voice that he was struggling too. He'd taken a leave of absence from diving, was seeing a therapist, trying to process what we'd encountered. I did some research of my own, digging into the Pelagic Geophysical Institute that had operated the Perseus IV. The organization was barely documented. A few references in academic journals, some contract records with government agencies, but no website, no public-facing information, nothing that explained what they were actually studying. I found one former employee, a marine biologist named Dr. Sarah Chen, who agreed to meet with me at a coffee shop in Seattle. She was nervous, looking over her shoulder constantly, and she spoke in hushed tones, even though there was no one close enough to overhear. She told me that the Institute had been investigating what they called abyssal anomalies, locations in the deep ocean where the normal laws of physics seemed to break down, where instruments gave impossible readings and crews reported experiences that couldn't be explained. Site 7 was one of several such locations they'd identified, and the Perseus IV was specifically designed to study these phenomena up close. But something had gone wrong on that final expedition. The crew had made contact with something, and whatever they'd found had affected them in ways that the Institute's scientists hadn't anticipated. Dr. Chen had been scheduled to be on that voyage, but had called in sick at the last minute. She considered it the luckiest decision of her life. When I asked her what she thought was down there, what could create the effects we documented, she shook her head. "I don't think it's a what," she said. "I think it's a where. The deep ocean isn't just unexplored. Parts of it are unexplorable because they exist in states that we're not equipped to perceive or understand. We think of the ocean as just another environment, deeper and darker than others, but fundamentally the same. But what if there are places where the ocean connects to something else, somewhere else? What if depth isn't just a measure of distance, but a transition into realities that operate by different principles entirely?" She wouldn't say anything more after that, and when I tried to follow up with her a month later, her phone number was disconnected and her social media accounts had been deleted. I kept diving after that because it's what I do and what I know, but I'm more careful now about the jobs I take. I turn down anything that involves deep trenches or unexplained wrecks, anything that feels even slightly off. Chen never went back to diving. Last I heard, he'd moved to Arizona, about as far from the ocean as you can get in the continental United States. I don't blame him. There are some things you can't unsee, some places you can't unvisit, and once you've been touched by something that exists outside the normal boundaries of reality, you're never quite the same. The Perseus IV is still down there, 320 meters below the surface, her lights still burning in the darkness. The insurance company eventually paid out the claim, ruling it as a loss due to severe weather, and as far as I know, no one has gone back to the site since we left. The data we recovered was classified by some government agency that Bjorn dealt with, and we all had to sign non-disclosure agreements that threatened serious legal consequences if we talked about what we'd found. This is the first time I've spoken about it openly, and I'm doing it now because I think people need to know what's down there, what's waiting in the deep places of the ocean. We think we know our planet because we've mapped the surface and charted the coastlines and planted flags on the peaks of mountains. But the deep ocean remains fundamentally alien, a vast and hostile environment that we've barely begun to explore. And maybe there's a reason for that. Maybe some frontiers are meant to remain unexplored, some depths are meant to stay dark, and some questions are better left unasked. I think about the Perseus 4 sometimes, sitting on the bottom in the eternal darkness. Her crew gone to whatever fate claimed them, her systems still running on power that shouldn't exist. I think about the structure I saw in that impossible space, the presence that watched us from the depths. And I wonder if we were lucky to escape, or if something let us go, if we were studied and measured and ultimately dismissed as uninteresting. I still see the ocean as my workplace, still respect it for the dangerous and unforgiving environment it is. But now I also see it as a boundary, a thin membrane separating our world from others that exist in the crushing depths, realities that press against our own. In places where the pressure is so great that space itself might fold and tear. And every time I descend, every time I swim out into the darkness with nothing but a thin suit and a lifetime of training between me and the void, I remember that boundary, and I'm careful not to cross it again, because some things that live in the deep aren't meant to be found, and some truths are too terrible to bring back to the surface.